Hello everyone, Leo K here. I had this topic on my mind last night. I was trying to fall asleep and it just kept popping up in my head. It's one thing I appreciate about Watch Dogs Legion, as well as Genshin Impact, along with some games I've played in the past, like Metal Gear Solid 5 and Dishonored. This concept is emergent gameplay, also known as systemic gameplay, and recently described by White Light as a game being dynamic or having dynamism. The idea that a game is reactive to you in just so many ways that your actions feel like they matter, not so much because the story is changing, but mostly because you can feel they're having very noticeable effects on the game state right now in the moment that you're doing them. I like to think of this as a push-pull, like a tug of war between vertical progression and what I call horizontal creativity or horizontal expression. Let's define what these mean. I'm going to use Genshin Impact for this, but you can really apply it to quite a few different games. So vertical progression is what most players think of when they even hear the word progression in general. It's your upgrades, it's leveling up. It's basically improving yourself, making yourself stronger, or making the game easier by, in one way or another, making a number go up, right? So a level 80 character is obviously going to do more damage than a level 20 character. But why is it obvious? It's obvious because playing games all of our lives, or even just existing in a very number-heavy society, this has taught us and trained us to feel that bigger number equals good, right? It's intuitive, it's conditioned, it's something we now instinctively understand, and that's exactly why game developers tend to use this kind of approach, when they're giving games a sense of change, a sense of evolution, and trying to keep things interesting without thinking too hard about it. The other reason is that it's intrinsically satisfying to get more of something, right? To feel numbers go up. This is a flashy animation, but this is a flashy animation that also involves Razor's level going up. It feels great because your entire life and your gaming career thus far have taught you that this will make your life easier. And not only that, you worked for this and you earned it. It feels extra good because it required you to be invested in the game emotionally and temporally, and then it rewarded that effort and investment by making you more effective. Now, if there isn't a sense of struggle, or at least a baseline level of efficacy to compare it to, your new higher damage numbers, they won't really have any context to contrast against, and they won't feel as good. It's because killing things was slower before that it feels awesome to kill them fast now. This is vertical progression. It's a very snacky, very fast foody, very kind of basic bitch sort of fun trademark. Almost every game, especially AAA games, use vertical progression of some kind because it's really easy for devs to harness and weaponize this kind of psychology. It doesn't even need to be done very well to end up being compulsively enjoyable. In the worst cases, look up Skinnerbox game design. In the worst cases, it's almost a game developer's cheat or hack. It hooks into that primal part of our brain that gets pleasure from seeing things increase or become quantitatively greater. It's why you keep playing games like Cookie Clicker or Destiny or really grind heavy MMOs. Even if you haven't genuinely enjoyed the game for weeks now, you just can't really pull yourself away from it. The problem with vertical progression, to me, is twofold. First, it's finite. There's only so much you can progress upward before it ends. And if you do try to have progression be infinite, then many players will feel like there is no longer a point to working hard toward it. It has no upper limit, so there's never a point at which you can feel, okay, great, I did a good job, now I can rest and be satisfied with my effort. Second, it's inherently repetitive, and it's not only inherently repetitive, it's inherently repetitive in a way that's really, really difficult to mask. This eventually becomes very mind-numbing. Now, the reason I mentioned difficult to mask there is because all video games, indeed all of gaming, is ultimately repetitive. Now you might be thinking, okay, then why is it fun at all? Well, a popular game design quote from Jamie Griesmer, a designer on Halo 1, is the idea that a good game is about creating 30 seconds of fun and repeating it thousands of times. Now the second half of his idea is actually left out of quotes, and that second half is that a truly great game fools the player into not realizing they're playing the same awesome 30 seconds over and over again. Now this includes different situations, different contexts, new spins on the existing 30 seconds. Some games just don't bother. The repetition is very front and center without enough variance to give it any staying power. Meanwhile, another game that might actually be more repetitive doesn't actually feel that way because it has so much variety in situations, contexts, enemy types, abilities, and so on that you barely even notice the loop. You're still playing the same 30 seconds of gameplay, but the way it's presented and the situations that you're applying those 30 seconds to are different enough that you don't really experience it that way. Now, the way this relates to vertical progression is basically the reason why games usually include multiple avenues of it. So you see, you don't just increase your level, you're also leveling up your talents. And you don't just level up your talents, you're also leveling your weapons. You don't just level your weapons, you also improve your gear, and so on and so forth. You're not just powering up the existing ones you have, but you're finding newer and stronger ones entirely. Again though, there's only so much that you can scale vertical progression before it gets irrevocably boring, and some players, like me, will be fatigued way earlier and sooner than others. So what's the alternative? That would be horizontal creativity or horizontal systems exploration. That was a whole fruit salad and a half of terminology I just threw at you, some of it non-standard, so I have to talk about what I mean here. You know when you drop a box on a boss fight's head in Metal Gear Solid 5 by using the supply drop mechanic? That normally only helps you get some ammo and resources back. Or the moment in Dishonored where you realize you could attach spring razors to crossbow bolts that are hanging in the air while time is frozen. Or even the moment you realized you can cross large bodies of water using Kaya and the Traveler's ability to combo off of each other's abilities, so you can spread ice that you use as walkable platforms. That's what I consider to be a more horizontal approach to gameplay. The idea is that you're not just tunnel visioning and pigeonholing yourself on raising your numbers anymore. Instead, you're using your brain more, your imagination, you're being creative, you're thinking outside the box and wondering to yourself, okay, how can I combine mechanics in interesting ways that give me an advantage? How can I do things in kind of an unorthodox way that maybe is, not so obvious. It's about poking at the system. It's about looking wide and trying to see the big picture in order to spot opportunities to do something nasty, something creative, something interesting or unfathomable. The cool thing about horizontal creativity is that more often than not, the gameplay reward that you get from this kind of playstyle and this kind of approach is always bigger and crazier than anything an equivalent amount of effort would ever give you if you injected that effort into vertical progression instead. Here's an example, right? The amount of oculi I would need to turn into statues of the Seven in order to get enough stamina to swim here really fast took me far, far longer than the time it took to discover that you can spread ice around like this. This is where we come to the second strength of horizontal creativity, and it's that this kind of systems exploration can be spread around a community at insane speed. You can cut your discovery time in half, sometimes even remove it completely, by finding fascinating guides, tweets, or forum posts that give you information on things you never even dreamed were possible. What's more, this kind of information can be really intoxicating, so when you first figure it out, it makes you want to share it with other players. This is how we as a community become stronger. Can it be helpful for me to share a guide with you about how to get better gear, how to get better stats? Sure, it can be. But you know what will always be more helpful and what will always be more fascinating? If I share with you the fact that you can use Berserk Blades to reset someone's detection state in AC Unity, or that shooting zombies in the leg to control them is often stronger and more ammo efficient than going for kills in Resident Evil 2, or that because the developers knew you would be climbing a lot of the Leeway region's hyper-tall mountains in Genshin Impact, the geo-attuned Traveler skill is a small meteor that you can slam into the sides of walls to climb quicker, something many players didn't even think of trying to do. Of course, with this kind of stuff, there are always going to be players who are kind of snobby or insufferable, scoffing and saying, "Oh, well, I figured that out from the start. I can't believe there are players who didn't know you could do this." The thing is, seeing the joy on those players' faces who I can give knowledge to, and improve their gaming experience by 50, 70, sometimes 100% in an instant, that'll always be worth sitting through the teeth-grinding monotony of gamer dudes who always want you to think they figured everything out by themselves without any help, without any community involvement. And you just know that those people are lying. Like, you can smell them out from a mile away. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. What else does horizontal creativity do? Why else is it so compelling and so beautiful? Well, I already alluded to a few things, but let's solidify them fully and make them truly concrete. One is that horizontal creativity offers a level of depth to games that have it, which games without it can never hope to match. What this necessarily means as well is that it's kind of the lifeblood of certain communities. Games with this kind of tactical depth and interesting possibility space are much more conducive to discussion than games without it, simply because it gives us so much more to talk about, you know? And if you've seen games that used to rely more on this kind of horizontal creativity and horizontal systems exploration, and if you've watched them kind of regress into just being very build-based, you'll notice that discussion and interesting conversations in those communities and in those forums, it almost always dies, and it almost always kind of ends up becoming this space on the internet where there's nothing to talk about. You know, people always end up making the same kind of threads over and over again because, of course they do. That's all there is to say. Now, second, this causes players to wake up a little bit because it gets us curious. You know, it makes us start wondering, hey, if we can do this crazy thing, then holy crap, you know, what else can we do? This is something that a strictly number-heavy game that's all about empowering your gear without much creativity in the short term can simply never hope to match, straight up. Now look, you can talk about builds until you're blue in the face, but there's only so much you can really say about them, because unless the game's build complexity is incredibly high, and the thing about AAA games is that they need to be accessible, so they very rarely feature such deep build complexity, there's just nowhere to go except the basic move of raise your attack, raise crit rate, crit damage, build some kind of passive that breaks combat a little bit more, and then just spam left click and win. That's it. That's your build diversity. This kind of learning is very mindless. It's very one note, you know? You just figure it out once and that's it. It's information that players just copy without necessarily understanding. And the reason they just copy it without necessarily understanding, you know, they just copy the build. They just make all their stats be, you know, exactly that. They make all their items be exactly that, and they don't really think about it. The reason why is because, you know, its effects aren't exactly something that you can feel, right? Meanwhile, the very concrete system exploits, the interesting tricks, the crazy movement tech, and interesting actions that have ripple effects and make the game more dynamic, all of these things are immediately noticeable as soon as you do them just once or twice for your first time, right? Third, I mentioned this earlier, but the effect that tricks discovered via horizontal creativity can have on your gameplay is absolutely massive. You know, a player can easily go from a weak player who's struggling a lot and they're having a hard time enjoying the game because it's just slapping them up left and right, with a cool trick that's, you know, based on horizontal creativity and systems exploration and emergence. This kind of player can easily go from a weak player to someone who's much more capable in many situations just because they learned a crazy technique that was discovered by a community mentor or even figured out together by dozens of different players working toward understanding. This is great because it gives players hope, right? It convinces them to stick with a game that maybe they're a little bit shaky on, and it's this kind of thing that allows us to retain players and also to kind of get new players interested, get people thinking about playing well, playing skillfully. Now, the point of encouraging people to play skillfully is not to impose some kind of elitist status quo on everybody. That's not the idea. The idea is we all know that when we feel like we're good at something, we enjoy it a lot more. My whole life, I've always just wanted people to enjoy the games that we're all playing, and whenever it's possible, for them to also enjoy the games that I really love. Now, every time we teach players something cool, something unexpected, flashy, new, or interesting that lets them be really powerful because they learned some crazy bit of knowledge, What we're actually doing is we're planting more love for that game in their hearts. Personally, I think that's amazing, and I find it way easier to appreciate any game that lets us do that. Not just once or twice in the beginning, you know, in the first few days that it comes out and releases, but for months and sometimes years ahead. This video was very unstructured, and I just wanted to speak out loud and put these thoughts somewhere. I hope you enjoyed it, and if I know my audience, I'm willing to bet many of you heard some stuff here that you can relate to a lot. So let me know how you felt about this. I'm gonna get some sleep. Stay sneaky, rogues.
Do you really need the assistance of a failed rebel when you already have my help?
They fixed me.